Roman dominion over the city of Jerusalem began in 63 BC, when Pompey Magnus entered the city and laid siege to the temple, which served as the most important place in Jewish life. Jerusalem by then reached its economic and cultural zenith. To the Jews, the city was the navel of the world, the axis of the universe, and there was nothing holier than Jerusalem. And the Jews were made once again a governed people. The fluidity that existed in Jerusalem between the religious and political powers made it necessary for Rome to maintain close supervision over the Jewish cult, particularly over the high priest. The high priest was a prominent figure of both political and religious matters, with power to decide all religious matters, enforce God's laws, and even make arrests. And if Rome wanted to control Jerusalem, they had to control the high priest. In the years of tumult that followed Roman occupation of Judea, as Rome became enmeshed in a debilitating civil war between Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar, the situation of Jewish farmers worsened. They found themselves stripped of their property, and from the hiding places in Galilee, a handful of displaced farmers exchanged their plows for swords and began fighting back. They roamed through the provinces, but to the Romans they were the lestai, bandits, rabble-rousers, and wanted to dispense divine justice against those traitorous Jews. The bandits claimed to be agents of God's retribution, cloaked their leaders in emblems of biblical kings and heroes, and openly declared their leader to be the Messiah, the promised one who would restore the Jews to glory. Messiah means the anointed one. Anointment is the practice of pouring or smearing of oil on someone charged with divine office. The principal task of the Messiah, popularly believed to be the descendant of King David, was to rebuild David's kingdom and reestablish the nation of Israel. To call somebody a Messiah at the time of Roman occupation was tantamount to declaring war on Rome. They needed to be stopped. Herod, the Roman client king of Judea, in 37 BC, marched to Jerusalem with a massive Roman army and wiped out the remnants of the Hasmonean dynasty. Rome named him King of the Jews, granting him a kingdom that would grow larger than that of King Solomon. Herod did a masterful job of maintaining order on behalf of Rome. Herod, however, was a Jew. The rebuilding and expansion of the Temple of Jerusalem did not work, for his aggressive attempts to Romanize Jerusalem enraged the pious Jews. Herod the Great died in 4 BC, and the Roman Emperor Augustus split the realm among his 3 sons. The division proved a disaster for Rome. The long and oppressive reign burst into a flood of riots and violent protests that could hardly be contained. The uprisings were also fueled by the messianic fervor of the Jews. The chaos and the bloodshed continued unabated until Caesar Augustus finally ordered his own troops into Judea to put an end to the uprising and place Jerusalem under a Roman governor, and in the year 6 CE, transformed all of Judea into a province ruled directly by Rome. Ancient Nazareth rests in the lower Galilee, and its name does not appear in any Jewish source before the 3rd century CE. Matthew and Luke claim that Jesus was born not in Nazareth, but in Bethlehem, even though the name Bethlehem does not appear anywhere else in the entire New Testament, except for a single verse in the Gospel of John. At the Feast of the Tabernacle, Jesus' family urged him to come along with them to Judea to celebrate. He said, "You go. I am not going to this festival. It is not yet my time." Yet unbeknownst to them, Jesus decides to follow them, and after he is revealed to the crowd, someone guesses his identity. Surely he is a prophet. This man is the Messiah. This is no simple declaration. It is, in fact, an act of treason. In the 1st century Palestine, simply saying the words, "This is the Messiah," aloud and in public, can be a criminal offense, punishable by crucifixion. The last of the 4 canonized Gospels, composed between 100 and 120 CE, John shows no interest at all in Jesus' physical birth, though he acknowledges that Jesus was a Nazarene. A similar lack of concern about Jesus' earthly origins can be found in the first gospel, Mark, written just after 70 CE. He focused on Jesus' ministry. He is uninterested either in his birth or in Jesus' resurrection, as he writes nothing at all about either event. Matthew's fanciful account of Jesus' flight into Egypt to escape Herod's massacre of all the sons born in and around Bethlehem in a fruitless search for the baby Jesus, an event for which there exists not a single shred of corroborating evidence in any chronicle or history of the time, whether Jewish, Christian, or Roman. A remarkable fact considering the many chronicles and narratives written about Herod, who was, after all, the most famous Jew in the whole of the Roman Empire. Matthew has Jesus flee to Egypt, not because it happened, but because it fulfills the words of the prophet Hosea, "Out of Egypt I had called my son." Luke places Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, not because it took place there, but because of the words of the prophet Micah. "And you, Bethlehem, from you shall come to me a ruler in Israel." Tradition claims Jesus' occupation was a tekton, a woodworker or a builder. He belonged to the lowest class of peasants in the first century Palestine. The overwhelming majority of Jews in Jesus' time would have only the most rudimentary grasp of Hebrew. Aramaic, the language of Jesus, must be the primary language of the Jewish peasantry. And that Jesus had brothers is, despite the Catholic doctrine of his mother Mary's perpetual virginity, virtually indisputable. It has been attested by both the Gospels and the letters of Paul. Far less is known about Jesus' father Joseph, who quickly disappears from the Gospels after the infancy narratives. Some believe that he died while Jesus was a child, but there are those who believe that Joseph never actually existed, that he was a creation of Matthew and Luke to account for the virgin birth. Outside of Matthew and Luke's infancy narratives, the virgin birth is never even hinted by anyone else in the New Testament. An even more contentious mystery about Jesus involves his marital status. Although there is no evidence in the New Testament to indicate whether Jesus was married, it would have been almost unthinkable for a 30-year-old Jewish male in Jesus' time to not have a wife. Celibacy was an extremely rare phenomenon in the first century Palestine. In the end, it is simply impossible to say much about Jesus' early life in Nazareth. Jesus was likely born the same year Judas the Galilean. The failed Messiah rampages through the countryside, burning with zeal in 4 BC. Prefect Pontius Pilate arrived in Jerusalem in the year 26 CE. Pilate's disdain for the Jews was obvious from the very first day he arrived in Jerusalem. The Gospels present Pilate as a righteous yet weak-willed man, so overcome with doubt about putting Jesus to death that he does everything in his power to save his life. This is pure fiction. What Pilate was known for was his extreme depravity and his total disregard for Jewish law and tradition. Despite his cold, hard cruelty to the Jews, Pontius Pilate became the longest-serving Roman governor of Judea. Of all the stories told about the life of Jesus, there is one that, more than any other word or deed, helps reveal who Jesus was and what Jesus meant. So revelatory is a single moment in Jesus' brief life that it alone can be used to clarify his mission. The year was approximately 30 CE. Jesus had just entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, flanked by a frenzied multitude shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Blessed be the coming kingdom of our father David!" The message conveyed to the city is unmistakable. The long-awaited Messiah, the true King of the Jews, has come to free Israel from its bondage. Striding up to Jesus in full view of everyone present, the temple authorities ask, "Teacher, tell us, is it lawful to pay the tribute to Caesar or not?" This is not a simple question. It is a test of zealotry. They are asking him essentially, "Are you a zealot or not?" "Show me a denarius," Jesus says, referring to the Roman coin used to pay tribute. "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "It is Caesar's," the authorities reply. Well then, give back to Caesar the property that belongs to Caesar, and give back to God the property that belongs to God. This is the zealot argument in its simplest form, and it seems enough for the authorities in Jerusalem to immediately label Jesus as a lestes, a bandit, a zealot. A couple of days later, after sharing a secret Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples head out in the dark of night to the Garden of Gethsemane to hide out among the gnarled olives. It is here, on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, that the authorities find him. "Have you come out here with swords and clubs to arrest me like a bandit?" Jesus asks. Jesus made sure his followers were armed before heading off to Gethsemane. "If you do not have a sword," Jesus instructs his disciples after the Passover meal, "go sell your cloak and buy one." Declared guilty, Jesus is sent to Golgotha to be crucified along two other men who are specifically called lestai, bandits. As with every criminal who hangs on a cross, Jesus is given a plaque, or titulus, detailing the crime for which he is being crucified. Jesus' titulus reads, "King of the Jews." His crime? Striving for kingly rule, sedition. And so, like every bandit and revolutionary, every rabble-rousing zealot and apocalyptic prophet who came before and after him, like Hezekiah, Judas, Theudas, Athronges, Simon son of Giora, Jesus of Nazareth is executed for daring to claim the mantle of king and Messiah. Capernaum was the ideal place for Jesus to launch his ministry. The Gospel of Luke claims that there were 72 disciples in all, and they included women, some of them named in the New Testament, Joanna, Mary, Susanna, and perhaps the most famous of all, Mary of Magdala. But among the 72, there was an inner core of disciples, all of them men, simply known as the 12. They included the brothers James and John, Philip, Andrew, Andrew's brother Simon, Matthew, Jude, James, Thomas, who would become legendary for doubting Jesus' resurrection and who would come to India and die in Madras in 72 AD, another Simon known as the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the man the Gospels claim would one day betray Jesus. The 12 would become one day the principal bearers of Jesus' message. Jesus' fame could no longer be confined to Capernaum. All of the Gospels confirm Jesus' miraculous deeds. Nearly a third of Mark consists of healings and exorcisms. To the modern mind, the stories of Jesus' healings and exorcisms seem implausible. Acceptance of his miracles forms the principal divide between the historian and the worshiper, the scholar and the seeker. Soon the authorities in Jerusalem will no longer be able to ignore this itinerant exorcist and worker. The closer he draws to the holy city, the more urgent the need to silence him will become. For it is not just Jesus' miraculous actions that they fear. It is the simple yet incredibly dangerous message conveyed through them. The kingdom of God is at hand. The central theme and unifying message of Jesus' brief 3-year ministry was the promise of the kingdom of God. Yet if one wants to uncover what Jesus himself truly believed, one must never lose sight of this fundamental fact. Jesus of Nazareth was first and finally a Jew. As a Jew, he was concerned exclusively with the fate of his fellow Jews. Israel was all that mattered to him. He insisted that his mission was solely to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. When it came to the heart and soul of Jewish faith, the law of Moses, Jesus was adamant that his mission was not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The oft-repeated commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, was originally given strictly in the context of internal relations within Israel. It reads, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Regarding the treatment of foreigners and outsiders, the Bible could not be clearer. You shall drive them out before you. They shall not live in your land. At the end of his life, when he stood beaten and bruised before Pilate to answer the charges made against him, Jesus was asked but a simple question: "Are you the king of the Jews?" Despite their relative successes, Jesus and his disciples restricted their activities to the northern provinces of Galilee, wisely keeping a safe distance from Judea. Word of Jesus and his followers has reached Antipas's court, and for whatever reason, Jesus did not openly call himself Son of God or the Messiah. Numerous figures are called Son of God, but Jesus called himself the Son of Man. This phrase appears about 80 times in the New Testament. He refuses to answer the charges leveled against him. When morning comes, Jesus is escorted again through the ramparts of the Antonia forest to appear before Pilate. Pilate's chief responsibility in Jerusalem is to maintain order on behalf of the emperor. Pilate, as the histories reveal, was not one for trials. In his 10 years as governor of Jerusalem, he had sent thousands upon thousands to the cross with a simple scratch of his reed pen on a slip of papyrus. This is the final moment in Jesus' ministry, the end of the journey that began 3 years earlier on the banks of the Jordan River. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus speaks only one other time after his interview with Pilate when he is writhing on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" In Mark's telling of the story, something happens between Jesus' trial and his death that is so incredible that it casts suspicion over the entire episode leading up to the crucifixion. When Pilate asks the crowd which prisoner they would like to have released, Jesus or Barabbas, the crowd shouts louder for Jesus' death. "Crucify him!" The scene makes no sense at all. The answer is simple. Mark was not writing for a Jewish audience. He was in Rome when it was written, and for a Roman audience. The Gospel of Matthew, written in Damascus some 20 years after the Jewish revolt from 66 through 73 CE, paints a picture of Pontius Pilate at great pains to set Jesus free. Matthew's Pilate literally washes his hands of any blame for Jesus' death. "I am innocent of this man's blood." Luke, writing in the Greek city of Antioch, not only confirms Pilate's guiltlessness for Jesus' death. In the Gospel of John, written in Ephesus around 100 CE, Pilate does everything he can to save the life of Jesus, not because he thinks he is guiltless, but because he seems to believe that Jesus may in fact be the Son of God. When asked by Pilate what he should do with their king, the Jews reply, "We have no king but Caesar." A story concocted by Mark strictly for evangelistic purposes to shift the blame for Jesus' death away from Rome is stretched with the passage of time, becoming in the process the basis for 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. It was the Jews who killed the Messiah. As with everything else in the Gospels, the story of Jesus' arrest, trial, and execution was written for one reason only: to prove that he was the promised Messiah. The Gospel writers obviously recognized how integral Jesus' death was to the nascent community, but the story of that death needed elaborating. It needed to be slowed down and refocused. It required certain details and embellishments on the part of the evangelists. As a result, this final, most significant episode in the story of Jesus of Nazareth is also the one most clouded by theological enhancements and flat-out fabrications. Crucifixion was a widespread and exceedingly common form of execution in antiquity. The reason crucifixion was so common is because it was so cheap. It could be carried out almost anywhere. All one needed was a tree. The torture could last for days without the need for an actual torturer. It was Rome that conventionalized crucifixion as a form of state punishment, creating a sense of uniformity in the process, particularly when it came to the nailing of the hands and feet to a crossbeam. So commonplace was crucifixion in the Roman Empire that Cicero referred to it as that plague. The purpose of crucifixion was not so much to kill the criminal, as it was to serve as a deterrent to others who might defy the state. For that reason, crucifixions were always carried out in public, at crossroads, in theaters, on hills, or on high ground, anywhere where the population had no choice but to bear witness to the gruesome scene. The criminal was always left hanging long after he had died. The crucified were almost never buried. The bones would then be thrown onto a heap of trash, which is how Golgotha, the place of Jesus' crucifixion, earned its name, the place of skulls. With his crime recorded in Pilate's logbook, Jesus would have been led out of the Antonia fortress and taken to the courtyard, where he would be stripped naked, tied to a stake, and savagely scourged, as was the custom for all those sentenced to the cross. The Romans would then have placed a crossbeam behind the nape of his neck and hooked his arms back over it, again as was the custom, so that the Messiah who had promised to remove the yoke of occupation from the necks of the Jews would himself be yoked like an animal led to slaughter. As with all those condemned to crucifixion, Jesus would have been forced to carry the crossbeam himself to a hill situated outside the walls of Jerusalem, directly on the road leading into the city gates. This way, every pilgrim entering Jerusalem for the holy festivities would have no choice but to bear witness to his suffering, to be reminded of what happens to those who defy the rule of Rome. The crossbeam would be attached to a scaffold or post, and Jesus' wrists and ankles would be nailed to the structure with 3 iron spikes. A heave, and the cross would be lifted vertically. Death would not have taken long. In a few short hours, Jesus' lungs would have tired, and breathing became impossible to sustain. That is how, on a bald hill covered in crosses, beset by the cries and moans of agony from hundreds of dying criminals, as a murder of crows circled eagerly over his head, waiting for him to breathe his last, the Messiah, known as Jesus of Nazareth, would have met the same ignominious end as every other Messiah who came before or after him. It was, the Gospels say, the 6th hour of the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on the day before the Sabbath when Jesus of Nazareth breathed his last. Jesus' end would have been swift and unnoticed by all. Yet Jesus was no common criminal, not for the evangelists who composed the narrative of his final moments. He was God's agent on earth. Surely this was the Son of God, a bewildered centurion at the foot of the cross declares before running off to Pilate to report what had happened. The disciples faced a profound test of their faith after Jesus' death. The crucifixion marked the end of their dream of overturning the existing system, of reconstituting the 12 tribes of Israel and ruling over them in God's name. Then something extraordinary happened. What exactly that something was is impossible to know. Jesus' resurrection is an exceedingly difficult topic for the historian to discuss, not least because it falls beyond the scope of any examination of the historical Jesus. Obviously, the notion of a man dying a gruesome death and returning to life 3 days later defies all logic, reason, and sense. One could simply stop the argument there, dismiss the resurrection as a lie, and declare belief in the risen Jesus to be the product of a deluded mind. Although the first resurrection stories were not written until the mid to late 90s, belief in the resurrection seems to have been a part of the earliest liturgical formula of the nascent Christian community. It is in fact the ultimate test of faith for Christians, as Paul wrote in that same letter to the Corinthians. If Christ had not been risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is in vain. Paul makes a key point. Without the resurrection, the whole edifice of Jesus' claim to the mantle of the Messiah comes crashing down. According to the law of Moses, Jesus' crucifixion actually marks him as the accursed of God. Anyone hung on a tree, that is, crucified, is under God's curse. The balding, gray-bearded old men who fixed the faith and practice of Christianity met for the first time in the Byzantine city of Nicaea in present-day Turkey. It was the summer of 325 CE. The men had been brought together by the Emperor Constantine and commanded to come to a consensus on the doctrine of the religion he had recently adopted as his own. Over the centuries since Jesus' crucifixion, there had been a great deal of discord and debate among the leaders of the church over whether Jesus was human or divine. After months of heated negotiations, the council handed to Constantine what became known as the Nicene Creed, outlining for the first time the officially sanctioned orthodox beliefs of the Christian Church. Jesus is the literal Son of God, the creed declared. He is light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same substance as of the Father. And for those who disagreed with the creed, those like Arians who believed that there was a time when Jesus was not. They were immediately banished from the empire and their teachings violently suppressed. After the temple was destroyed, the holy city burned to the ground, and the remnants of the Jerusalem assembly dispersed. Paul underwent a stunning rehabilitation in the Christian community. With the possible exception of the Q document, the only writings about Jesus that existed in 70 CE were the letters of Paul. Without the Mother Assembly to guide the followers of Jesus, the movement's connection to Judaism was broken, and Paul became the primary vehicle through which a new generation of Christians was introduced to Jesus the Christ. His notion of a wholly new religion, free from the authority of a temple that no longer existed, unburdened by a law that no longer mattered, and divorced from a Judaism that had become a pariah, was enthusiastically embraced by converts throughout the Roman Empire. Hence, in 398 CE, when, according to legend, another group of bishops gathered at a council in the city of Hippo Regius in modern-day Algeria to canonize what would become known as the New Testament. They chose to include in the Christian scriptures one letter from James, the brother and successor of Jesus, 2 letters from Peter, the chief apostle and first among the 12, 3 letters from John, the beloved disciple and pillar of the church, and 14 letters from Paul, the deviant and outcast who was rejected and scorned by the leaders in Jerusalem. In fact, more than half of the 27 books that now make up the New Testament are either by or about Paul. 2,000 years later, the Christ of Paul's creation has utterly subsumed the Jesus of history. The memory of the revolutionary zealot who walked across Galilee gathering an army of disciples with the goal of establishing the kingdom of God on earth, the magnetic preacher who defied the authority of the temple priesthood in Jerusalem, the radical Jewish nationalist who challenged the Roman occupation and lost, has been almost completely lost to history. That is a shame, because the one thing any comprehensive study of the historical Jesus should hopefully reveal is that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the man, is every bit as compelling, charismatic, and praiseworthy as Jesus the Christ. He is, in short, someone worth believing in. As always, thank you for your attention to this video. If you liked it, click the like button and consider subscribing for more videos.